The ledger hit the warped plank of the ferry dock so hard that the tin cup of black coffee rattled off the railing and splashed into the Cimarron River below. "Every single crossing," Rosa Merriweather said, her voice low and dangerously even, one finger pressed flat against the open page. "Every man, every horse, every mule, every wagon. Date, time, direction, and description. I have been keeping this record since the spring of 1878. That is 5 years, Mr. Brenner. 5 years of entries." Cyrus Brenner stood on the far end of the dock, his hat in one hand and a wanted poster crumpled in the other, staring at the woman across from him with an expression he had never worn before in 15 years of tracking men across the frontier. It was not contempt. It was not impatience. It was something closer to the feeling a man gets when he realizes the ground beneath his boots is not actually solid. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that Cole Duchamp crossed this river." "I am telling you he crossed this river on the 14th of March, 1883 at 7 minutes past noon, riding a gray roan with a notched left ear, wearing a brown duster coat with a tear along the right shoulder seam, accompanied by 2 men whose descriptions I have also logged." She turned the ledger so he could see the handwriting. Precise, meticulous, not a single smear. He was heading east, not south. "You have been riding south for 3 days chasing a ghost, Mr. Brenner, because you assumed the trail ended at the river." The silence between them was so complete that the sound of the Cimarron pushing against the dock pilings filled the entire world. Cyrus Brenner looked at that ledger, and then he looked at the woman holding it, and something shifted inside his chest that he could not immediately name but that would, in the coming weeks and months, change the entire shape of his life. This is how it had begun. Or rather, this is where it crashed into its first true reckoning. To understand why a man as hard and solitary as Cyrus Brenner was standing on a remote ferry dock in Indian Territory, with his carefully constructed certainty crumbling around him like Dry Creek Bank, you would need to go back to the weeks before, to the moment a job became something more complicated than a job, and to the woman who had built something extraordinary in the most overlooked place on the frontier. Rosa Merriweather had come to the Cimarron crossing in the spring of 1880, when she was 24 years old and carrying nothing but a canvas pack, a surveying compass, a set of carpenter's tools, and the last letter her father had ever written her before a fever took him in a rented room in Dodge City. The letter said 3 things she held onto like rope: that she was smarter than any man he had ever met, that the river land at the old Dawson Crossing had been legally filed under her name in the Territorial Land Office, and that the ferry business, if she built it right, would make her free. Freedom was the word her father had used. Not comfortable, not safe. Free. She had built the ferry herself, not hired men to build it, not relied on a husband or a brother or a neighbor. She had felled timber from the cottonwood grove 300 yards up the bank. She had split and shaped the planks. She had rigged the cable mechanism using a design she had adapted from a bridge engineering pamphlet she had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis. And she had launched the flat-bottomed vessel on a Tuesday morning in late April with no ceremony, and no audience except a red-tailed hawk sitting on a fence post, who regarded the whole enterprise with magnificent indifference. The ledger had started as a practical necessity. She charged by the crossing and needed records for her own accounting, but Rosa was a woman whose mind did not stop at the edge of the immediately useful. She had a quality of attention that compelled her to notice everything, to record everything, because the world moved through her crossing, and the world, she had understood early, was full of consequences that only became visible in retrospect. So she noted descriptions. She noted behaviors. She noted the way a man held his reins when he was nervous versus when he was calm, the way a horse's hooves were shod or unshod, the condition of a wagon's wheel grease, the direction of travel, the time of day. She had filled 11 ledgers by the time Cyrus Brenner rode up to her dock in the 3rd week of April, 1883. He came from the west, out of the late afternoon glare, which meant she saw his silhouette before she saw his face. A large man, broad through the shoulders, sitting a dark bay horse with the unconscious authority of someone who spent more time in the saddle than out of it. 2 guns on his belt, a rifle in the saddle scabbard, saddlebags that looked heavy and well organized. She noted all of this before he had pulled within speaking distance. She was at the wheel mechanism on the near bank, doing her daily maintenance check on the cable tension, and she straightened up and waited. "This the Merriweather crossing?" he asked, and his voice was the kind of voice that had been formed over years of use outdoors, a little rough, not unkind, carrying without effort. "It is," she said. "I need to cross." "That is what most people who arrive at a ferry crossing need," she said pleasantly. "It is 50 cents for horse and rider." He swung down from his horse with an ease that told her he was not stiff from today's riding alone, which meant he was either exceptionally fit or accustomed to far longer distances in the saddle, possibly both. He was younger than his voice had suggested. Late 20s or early 30s, she estimated, with a face that the sun and wind had worked on considerably but which had begun with good bones, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it was built to take argument and give nothing back. "I am looking for a man named Cole Dutchamp," he said, pulling a piece of paper from his coat and holding it out. "You seen him?" She took the paper and looked at it. The drawing was rough, as wanted poster drawings always were, but it captured something true about the eyes. She knew those eyes, she had seen them across this very railing, but she folded the paper and handed it back without yet saying what she knew. "You a lawman?" she asked. "Bounty hunter?" He said it without apology or decoration. "Name is Cyrus Brenner. Dutchamp is wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. There is a $2,000 reward." Rosa looked at him steadily. "What does a person have to do to collect a reward like that?" "Bring him in alive if possible. If not possible, bring in what proves identification." She was quiet for a moment, turning over her thoughts the way she turned over decisions about the cable mechanism, checking each part for weakness before committing weight to it. She had learned very early that information was not a thing to be given without understanding where it was going and what it would do once it arrived there. "Cross first," she said. "I have business on the other side. We can talk on the water." She did not usually invite conversation during crossings. She watched him accept this with a mild expression that did not quite mask his impatience, and she noted the impatience. A man in a hurry, which meant a man who might cut corners, and corners in her observation were where mistakes lived. The crossing took 10 minutes. The Cimarron was running medium-high for April, the current brisk but not treacherous. Rosa worked the cable and the steering pole with the practiced economy of someone for whom the motion had become so habitual it required only a fraction of her attention, which left the rest of her attention free to observe her passenger. Cyrus Brenner stood near the prow, one hand light on the railing, watching the water with the focused awareness of a man who had learned the hard way to pay attention to moving things. He held his horse's bridle loosely, and the horse was calm. A man who kept a calm horse was a man who was consistent in his handling, which told her something about his character. "How long have you been tracking Dutchamp?" she asked. 11 days out of Caldwell." "That is a long ride." "He is a long ride kind of problem," Cyrus said. "What did he do in Caldwell?" "Robbed a bank, killed the teller and a deputy who tried to stop him, shot a woman in the shoulder when she was unfortunate enough to be standing near a window." He paused. "She lived. The deputy did not." Rosa kept her eyes on the water. She thought about the man who had crossed her ferry on March 14th. He had not seemed like a man capable of that kind of casual violence, but she had learned long ago that was exactly the kind of man who was. The ones who looked like violence were usually the ones who feared it too much to commit it without cause. The ones who looked ordinary were the ones to watch. "You picked up his trail in Caldwell and followed it west?" she asked. "West and then south." Signs pointed south. "Horse droppings, a camp with a certain kind of ash, the kind you get from Cottonwood, a description from a settler woman outside of Enid." He looked at her directly. "Then I hit the river and the trail went cold." "Trails do not go cold," Rosa said. "People stop looking." Something moved across his face, not offense exactly. More like recognition. They reached the eastern bank and she secured the ferry. He led his horse off the ramp, and she thought he was going to mount and ride, get what he came for and be done with her, but instead he turned and looked at her directly in the fading afternoon light. "You know something," he said. It was not a question and it was not an accusation. It was simply an accurate statement delivered with zero ornamentation. "I know a great many things," she said. "That is generally the result of paying attention for an extended period of time. About Dutchamp. About many people who cross this river." She looked back toward the dock where her small house sat on the rise above the bank, 2 rooms and a storage loft, solid and unpretty and entirely hers. "Come up to the house. I have coffee if you want it, and I have something more useful than coffee." She would not realize until much later, sitting with Cyrus Brenner on the narrow porch of that house as the last light bled out of the April sky, that the word she had chosen was the one her father had always used. Something more useful. He had said it every time he had offered her a book instead of a doll, a compass instead of a ribbon, a lesson instead of a story. "The most loving thing one person can give another," he had told her once, "is something more useful than what they thought they needed." She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the iron stove and set the 11th ledger on the table between them. "I log every crossing," she said simply. "Date, time, direction, description of passenger and animal and vehicle. I have done so for 3 years. Cyrus Brenner looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. "Why?" "Because the world moves through a crossing point," she said, "and motion leaves records, and records tell you things that memory alone cannot hold with sufficient accuracy." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, and she could see him recalibrating something, the way a man recalibrates when the terrain does not match the map he was expecting. "May I look?" "That is why I brought it out," she said. He opened the ledger and she watched his face as he began to read. Not just scanning, she noticed, actually reading, letting the entries land, comparing them to things he already knew. His finger stopped on the March 14th entry. Rosa leaned forward and pointed. "That description matches the poster you showed me. Gray roan, notched left ear, brown duster with a tear on the right shoulder. The notched ear is the detail I am most confident about. I have an eye for horses." "He was heading east," Cyrus said quietly. "East, not south." She let that sit for a moment. "You have been riding south for 11 days, chasing the wrong direction entirely, Mr. Brenner." He sat back in his chair and his eyes moved to the middle distance for several seconds. She watched the muscles in his jaw work. A man absorbing a significant blow to his certainty. "What towns are east of here?" he asked finally. "Following the Cimarron east you reach Perkins, then Stillwater, then the Creek Nation territory. If he wanted to disappear into the Cherokee or Creek land, he could do it. There are communities in the 5 civilized tribes' territories where a white outlaw with money can buy protection and silence. You know the territory." "I cross it daily," she said. "I talk to everyone who gets on my ferry. I listen to what they say and what they do not say. This is my world, Mr. Brenner, and I have studied it the way another person might study medicine or law." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she felt the quality of his attention change. It was still sharp, still assessing, but something else had entered it, something she could not immediately classify. "How long would it take to reach Stillwater from here?" he asked. "Riding hard, 2 days. Riding smart, 2 days. The difference is what condition you and your horse are in when you arrive." "And you think he is in Stillwater?" "I think he crossed this river heading east on March 14th. What he did afterward is your business to determine. But I can tell you that 2 men have crossed this ferry in the weeks since, traveling west from the direction of Stillwater, who matched the descriptions of the 2 companions I logged alongside Dutchamp, which suggests something drew them back west while he stayed east." Cyrus was very still. "You got descriptions of the 2 men with him as well." "I told you. I log everything." She turned the ledger to the relevant entry. The taller one had a facial scar running from the left cheekbone to the jaw. The other was heavyset with very light, almost white hair. "Do those descriptions match anyone in connection with Dutchamp?" The expression that crossed his face then was one she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not quite shock and not quite awe. It was the particular look of a man who has spent years believing he is the most competent person in any given room, finally meeting a room where that assumption required serious revision. "The scarred one is a man called Decker Hayes," he said slowly. "The white-haired one is Billy Voss. They are both named in the warrants connected to the Caldwell robbery." Hayes was standing outside the bank. Voss drove the wagon. He paused. "Miss Merriweather, these are very useful descriptions." "More useful than what you thought you needed," she said, without quite knowing why. He stayed that night. Not in her house, which would have been inappropriate in 1883 Indian Territory for a woman living alone, but she offered the use of her small equipment shed, which was dry and had a clean floor, and he accepted without argument and without making the offer into something it was not, which rose another point in her private accounting of his character. In the morning she made breakfast for both of them, which was her habit when travelers were still on her property at dawn, and they ate on the porch as the fog lifted off the Cimarron and the cottonwoods began to show their pale new leaves. He asked her about the ledger system while he ate, how she organized it, how she indexed entries to make retrieval possible. She explained it precisely and without false modesty, because false modesty was something she had decided at a young age was a waste of the time of everyone involved. He asked intelligent questions, which pleased her more than she expected. "You should be working for the Marshal's service," he said. "The Marshal's service does not employ women," she said. "That is a loss for the Marshal's service." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "That is a generous thing to say. It is an accurate thing to say. Generosity has nothing to do with it." He pushed back from the small table they had set between their chairs. "I need to ride for Stillwater, but I want to ask you something first." "Ask." "If I need to come back and cross the river again, would you still be here?" "I will always be here," she said. "This is my crossing." He nodded as though that were the most natural and reasonable answer in the world. He paid for the coffee and the shed, though she had not asked for payment for either, and he saddled his horse with that same quiet efficiency she had observed the day before, and then he did something that surprised her. Before he mounted, he turned back and looked at her standing on the porch. "My name is Cyrus," he said. "Not Mr. Brenner." "All right," she said. "Cyrus." "Thank you, Rosa." He used her name like it was a thing of value, not a casual familiarity. "You just gave me back 11 days." He rode east, and the morning closed around the sound of his horse until there was nothing left but the river and the cottonwoods and the slow, steady certainty of her own life. Rosa told herself that was the end of it, and she believed this completely for approximately 4 days. And then she stopped believing it and started wondering, which was a condition that annoyed her considerably because she was not the kind of woman who wondered about men. She was the kind of woman who built ferries and maintained ledgers and understood river currents and could calculate load weights from memory. Wondering was a vulnerability, and she had worked very hard to arrange her life so that it contained as few vulnerabilities as possible. But she wondered about Cyrus Brenner. She wondered whether he had reached Stillwater safely. She wondered whether the information she had provided had been correct in its inference. She wondered whether Cole Duchamp was where she suspected him to be, and whether the meeting between the bounty hunter and the outlaw would go the way such meetings generally went, which was badly for at least one party. She kept working. There were fences to maintain along the bank approach, and the upstream cable anchor needed repacking with fresh grease, and she had received a mail order of 3 new books from a bookseller in Kansas City that she intended to read with the thorough enjoyment of someone for whom books were both pleasure and education. She ran the ferry. She logged the crossings. She managed her accounts with the precision of someone who understood that solvency was another word for independence, and independence was another word for everything she had. 2 weeks passed. On a Thursday afternoon in early May, she was in the middle of a crossing with a settler family in a wagon, 2 adults and 3 young children. heading west toward new land they had filed on under the Homestead Act, when she saw a rider come down the eastern bank approach at a pace that suggested urgency. She finished the crossing, collected her fee, helped the settler guide his wagon off the ramp onto the western bank, and started back across. Halfway across, she was close enough to see that the rider was Cyrus Brenner, and that he was riding a different horse than the dark bay, a stocky reddish-brown animal that moved with less grace but looked sturdy and dependable, and that there was a second horse on a lead line behind him. She secured the ferry on the eastern bank and waited. He looked different than she remembered. More tired, certainly. There was a bandage visible on his left forearm where his sleeve was rolled back against the warmth. But his eyes when he looked at her were something she had not seen in them before. "He was in Stillwater," Cyrus said. "I know," she said. "I expected he would be. I brought him in." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Reward paid. Decker Hayes and Billy Voss were picked up by the territorial marshal in Guthrie 2 days ago. All 3 are in custody." Rosa looked at the folded paper. "Is that what I think it is?" "Half of it," he said. $1,000, I want you to have it." She stared at him. For the first time in several years, she found herself genuinely without an immediate response. "You found him," Cyrus said. "Without your ledger, I would have ridden south until I ran out of territory and given up. Duchamp would be free, and the deputy's family in Caldwell would have no justice at all. You gave me everything that mattered." "You are the one who rode to Stillwater and made the arrest," she said. "That is worth considerably more than consultation." "Is it?" He was still on his horse, looking down at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite the professional acknowledgement of a debt, that was something more personal and harder to name. "I have been riding for 15 years, Rosa. I have tracked men across every territory west of the Mississippi. I have never, not once, been redirected by better information than I was carrying. I needed to come back and say that to you directly. The river moved. The cottonwoods shifted in the light wind. Somewhere upriver a heron called once." "Come in for coffee," she said finally. "You look like you have ridden hard for several days." "I have ridden hard for several days. Your arm. It is nothing serious. Duchamp was not inclined to be brought in peacefully." "I expected that as well," she said, and led him up from the bank. Over the next 2 hours, something changed between them by increments so gradual, and yet so decisive that it was impossible to identify the precise moment it happened, the way it is impossible to identify the precise moment afternoon becomes evening. They sat on her narrow porch in the warmth of early May, and he told her about Stillwater, and she listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without impatience, following the thread of events with the same quality of attention she brought to the river crossing logs. Duchamp had been living under a false name in a boarding house, working intermittently at a feed store, paying for his room with money from the Caldwell robbery. Cyrus had spent 3 days in town, asking careful questions in the way of a man who understood that the wrong question to the wrong person could end an investigation before it reached its purpose. He had found Duchamp on the 4th day, confronted him in a livery stable at the edge of town, and the confrontation had been the kind that left marks on both parties, though it had ended the way it needed to end. "Were you frightened?" Rosa asked. He thought about the question with more seriousness than she expected. "I was focused," he said. "I find there is not much room for fear when you are completely occupied with what you are doing." "I find the same thing," she said. "Fear finds its way in when the mind is idle." He looked at her with that recalibrating look again. "You have been frightened out here. I am a woman alone on a river crossing in Indian Territory in 1883, she said. "I have been in situations that required me to manage fear carefully, yes. The first winter I was here, before I had established any kind of relationship with the Creek families who live on the eastern bank, there were 3 men who thought my situation was an opportunity. What happened? I had a shotgun, and I had the sense to let them see it before they made a decision that could not be undone." She looked at her hands, which were strong and capable and permanently marked by the work of building, and maintaining her ferry. And one of the creek men, an elder named Harrison Fixico, happened to come down to the bank that same morning and stood there watching until the three men decided their business was elsewhere. Harrison Fixico. He has been a friend to me for 3 years. His family and I have an arrangement. They help keep watch on my operation when I need to travel for supplies. I help teach reading to the children who want to learn. She paused. The Creek Nation has been through things that are beyond the scope of my describing adequately. The least I can do is not treat any of them as less than they are. Cyrus was quiet for a moment. You are not like the people I generally encounter on this frontier, he said. What are the people you generally encounter on this frontier like? Hard, closed, looking out for themselves in the narrowest possible sense. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You are hard, I think, in the sense of being strong and self-sufficient, but you are not closed. She considered that. Closing off would cost me too much. My work depends on understanding people accurately. You cannot understand what you refuse to observe. And what do you observe about me? He asked, and there was something in the question that was not quite vulnerability, but was adjacent to it. The kind of question a person asks when they have reached a moment where they are willing to receive an honest answer. She looked at him directly. I observe a man who is very good at what he does, and has been doing it long enough to wonder whether what he does is the whole of what he is. I observe a man who is considerably more thoughtful than his occupation suggests. I observe a man who rowed back to this ferry, specifically to return a portion of a reward he had no legal obligation to share, which tells me something important about his understanding of fairness. The silence after that was the comfortable kind, not the waiting kind. You are right on all 3 counts, he said quietly. He stayed 3 days that second visit. Not in her house, still in the equipment shed, still with the absolute propriety that the time and place required, but they spent the daylight hours in each other's company with a naturalness that surprised them both. He was useful to have around, she discovered, not in the way of a man who imposes helpfulness to establish dominance, but in the genuine way of someone who sees a thing that needs doing and does it without ceremony. He repacked the upstream cable anchor while she ran the ferry, having noticed it needed work when she mentioned it the first night. He located a soft spot in the dock planking and replaced it using timber from her supply stack, measuring and cutting with a competence that told her he had done physical work before his years of tracking. She showed him her indexing system for the ledgers. He spent an hour going through them with his full attention, and she could see the information reorganizing itself in his mind, the way information does when an intelligent person encounters a new and efficient structure for holding it. Do you realize what you have built here? He said, looking up from the 10th ledger. A ferry business, she said. A record of a significant portion of the movement of people and goods through this part of the territory, kept with better accuracy and more useful detail than anything the territorial government possesses. He set the ledger down. If the Marshal's Service knew this existed, they would be at your door. The Marshal's Service can come to my door through the front like everyone else, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, unguarded and warm, and it changed his face completely. She thought about that laugh for a long time after he rode out on the 3rd morning, heading northwest toward Caldwell to collect the remainder of his fees and close out the accounts connected to the Duchamp case. He said he would be back through in 3 or 4 weeks if she had no objection. She said she had no objection and was privately pleased by the steadiness of her own voice when she said it. She thought about the laugh, and she thought about the way he had said her name from the very first time he used it, as though it were something he intended to be careful with, and she thought about a lot of things she had not expected to think about, and she concluded that this was probably a significant inconvenience but not necessarily a bad one. The world continued to move through her crossing. She logged it all. He came back in 4 weeks exactly, on a Saturday morning in early June, when the prairie east of the river was just beginning to show the full green weight of early summer. He brought her 3 things. A tin of tea that he had purchased in Caldwell because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she preferred it to coffee in the evenings. A new technical pamphlet about cable engineering from a publishing house in Chicago that he had found in a bookstore and thought she might find useful, and a look in his eyes that was no longer complicated or uncertain. She met him at the dock, and he handed her the tea and the pamphlet, and she looked at both and then looked at him. "You paid attention," she said. "I tend to when something is worth paying attention to," he said. The river pushed steadily along. A pair of mallards crossed above them heading north. The morning smelled of grass and water and the faint smoke from her breakfast fire. "Come in for breakfast," she said, because it was what she had to offer and it was what she wanted to give. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. Over the summer, he came back to the Cimarron crossing 7 more times, and each visit was longer than the one before. He was not always on a specific job. Sometimes he was passing through from one job to another, and the Cimarron crossing was, as he explained with perfect logic, exactly on the route between where he had been and where he was going. She received this explanation with the slight smile it deserved and made room in her schedule for the visits. He met Harrison Fixico in July, when the creek elder came to the crossing to collect a delivery of seed that Rosa had ordered on behalf of the Fixico family. Cyrus shook Fixico's hand with genuine respect, not the performed respect she sometimes observed in men who wanted to seem decent without actually being so, but the real thing, the kind that looks directly and listens when spoken to. Fixico watched Cyrus the way old men watch new things, with neither hurry nor dismissal, and when he left he said something to Rosa in MV that she understood enough of to translate roughly as a statement about a man who had not yet learned what he was for. She thought that was probably true. In August, during his 4th visit of that summer, they were sitting on the porch in the long evening light when he said, without particular preamble, "I want to tell you something about my past." "All right," she said. "I have not lived a clean life in every regard," he said. "Before I took up bounty work, I spent 2 years with a cattle outfit in Texas that was not operating within the full measure of what was legal. I was young and I needed money, and I told myself that the justifications were sufficient." He looked at the river. "They were not sufficient. I have made peace with that, in the sense that I have tried to put more on the right side of the ledger than the wrong side in the years since. But I wanted you to know it, because I find I do not want there to be things between us that are concealed." She absorbed this. What kind of cattle operation? The kind that did not always ask careful questions about where the cattle came from or whose brand was on them originally. "Did you personally cause harm to anyone?" "Not directly. I drove cattle and kept my eyes forward and did not ask questions and collected my pay." She was quiet for a moment. "My father ran a small trading business for a time when I was 12 that turned out to involve the resale of goods that had been stolen," she said. "He did not know when he began. When he found out, he walked away immediately and lost everything he had invested. He spent years afterward living with the weight of it, not because he was legally guilty of anything, but because he had been part of something wrong even through ignorance." She paused. "I think the measure of a person is not whether they have been in proximity to wrong action. It is what they do once they see it clearly." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the most precise thinker I have ever met," he said. "And I mean that with complete sincerity." "I know you do," she said. "That is one of the things I appreciate about you. You say what you mean." "I want to say something I mean right now." "Then say it." "I have been coming back to this crossing for reasons that have nothing to do with needing to cross a river," he said. "I expect you know that." "I do. And I want to know whether those reasons are something you welcome or something you merely tolerate." Rosa looked at the man sitting across from her in the evening light of the frontier summer, this complicated, capable, ultimately decent man who had ridden into her life on the wrong trail and stayed because the right one had something better on it. She had spent years building a life that required nothing from anyone else. She had done it deliberately and successfully, and without regret. And she found, examining herself with the same honest attention she brought to everything, that she did not want to close this person out of it. "I welcome them," she said. The look that crossed his face was worth everything it had cost her in careful wondering and suspended certainty. He did not take her hand that evening. He was, in this as in everything, a man who moved at a considered pace and did not reach for things before they were ready to be held. But when he left the following morning, he held her gaze for a moment longer than practicality required, and she held it back, and something was established between them that did not need any further language. He came back in September. And in October, on a Sunday morning with the cottonwoods showing gold and the Cimarron running lower and calmer with the end of the summer rains, he asked her to walk with him along the bank. They walked for an hour, talking about everything and nothing, about the changes she was planning to the ferry mechanism for the winter, about a book he had read in a hotel room in Wichita that had surprised him considerably, about the politics of the territory and the changes the railroad was beginning to make to the patterns of movement she tracked in her ledger. She watched how he walked alongside her, matching his pace to hers without any performance of adjustment, just naturally keeping step. Then he stopped at a place where the bank was wide and flat, and the river curved gently, and the light came through the cottonwood branches in long October pieces. "I have been thinking about what the future looks like," he said. "My future specifically." "What conclusions have you reached?" she asked. "That I do not want to spend it moving constantly from one job to the next and sleeping in equipment sheds and hotel rooms." He looked at her directly. "I am 31 years old and I have been riding this frontier since I was 16, and I know how to track a man and bring him in, and I have made a living at it, but it has never felt like a life. Not a full one, and now I am standing on the bank of the Cimarron with a woman who has built more of a real life in 3 years on this crossing than I have managed in 15 years of motion, and I find myself wanting to know whether there is room in that life for me." He paused. "Not as a lodger in the equipment shed." Rosa looked at the river. She thought about what her father had written. She thought about freedom and what it actually meant, whether it was the same as isolation or whether it was something larger, something that could hold another person without losing its essential nature. "What would you do here?" she asked, "if you stayed?" "Whatever needed doing," he said. "I know how to work. I know how to build. I know how to manage difficult situations, and I know how to be reliable, which I think is perhaps the most important of those things." He looked at the water. "And I know how to be honest with someone I respect, which is not a skill I always had but one I have worked at." "The crossing does well enough for one person," she said. "But there is room for more operation. The volume of traffic has been increasing every year. I have been thinking about expanding the dock structure and adding a second cable line for high water crossings. I can help build that." "I know you can." She turned and looked at him fully. "Cyrus, I am not a woman who will diminish herself to accommodate someone else's comfort. I will not become smaller or quieter or less exacting about my work. I am the operator of this crossing. I built it. I run it." "I know that," he said. "I do not want you to be different than what you are. I am asking to be part of what you have built, not to rebuild it in a different shape." She held that statement in her mind for a moment, testing its structural integrity the way she tested the ferry planking, pressing on each board to find any give. There was none. "Then yes," she said, "there is room." He did take her hand then. His hand was large and rough with the same kind of work marking as hers, and it held hers with a firmness that was not a grip, but was something more like an intention. And they stood on the wide bank of the Cimarron with the October light in the cottonwoods and the river moving along below them. And it was not a grand moment in any way the world would have recognized as such. It was simply two people who had found each other through the right chain of consequences, arriving at the place they were supposed to be. They were married in November of 1883. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Elias Cord, who passed through the Cimarron crossing every 6 weeks on his regular route. Harrison Fixico and his wife Naomi were in attendance, along with 3 other Creek families from the eastern bank, and a cattle driver named Walt Pemberton who happened to be crossing that day, and was sufficiently cheerful about the development to accept Rosa's invitation to stay and witness the proceedings. Naomi Fixico brought food she had prepared, dishes that Rosa had come to know and appreciate over 3 years of neighborliness, and the gathering was small and unpretentious and completely genuine, which was exactly the kind of wedding Rosa had always imagined if she had imagined one at all, which she had been careful not to do. Cyrus, at some point during the preparations, produced a ring from his coat pocket that he had purchased in Wichita during what she had understood to be a brief business trip. It was a simple gold band, not ornate, and he put it on her finger with a steadiness of hand that she thought was characteristic. And when Elias Cord asked whether he would take Rosa Merriweather as his wife, he said yes in the same tone he used for everything, direct and without decoration, as though the whole truth of the matter were contained in the simple word and needed nothing added to it. She kept her name. Cyrus had not expected otherwise. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the first winter Rosa had not spent alone at the crossing, and she found the adjustment smaller than she expected and the comfort larger. Cyrus worked without being asked and did not clutter her system with his own contradicting impulses. He understood, quickly and without needing instruction, that the ledger and the records and the organization of the operation were hers and were not to be altered, and he found his place in the physical work of maintenance and expansion that she had been planning since before he arrived. They expanded the dock in January, working on the coldest days when the traffic was lightest, and she taught him the cable system with the same precision she brought to everything, explaining the engineering logic so he understood not just the procedure but the principle, because a person who understood the principle could adapt when something unexpected happened, and on a frontier river crossing, something unexpected was always eventually going to happen. He was a good student, better than good. He had a mechanical intelligence that she had suspected and that the work confirmed, and he caught errors in her own calculations twice over the winter, gently and without any air of correction, but simply in the way of someone thinking alongside another person. She found she liked thinking alongside someone. She had not expected to. There was an evening in February, the coldest week of the year, when the river was running with ice chunks and they had been forced to suspend crossings for 2 days, and they sat by the iron stove with 2 lamps going, and she read aloud from one of her books while he worked on mending harness leather, and the whole of the small house held a warmth that was not only the fire. And she looked up from the page at one point and found him watching her with an expression of such uncomplicated contentment that she felt it land in her chest like something settling into its proper place. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that this is what a home feels like." She looked back at her book. "Yes," she said, "it is." Spring came with the renewed energy that the frontier spring always brought, an increase in traffic as homesteaders moved, and cattle drives began their seasonal migrations, and the world started moving again after the relative stillness of winter. Rosa updated her indexing system to accommodate Cyrus's habit of noting certain additional details she had not previously included, specifically the condition of the roads and trails people reported coming from various directions, which created a secondary data set about infrastructure conditions that turned out to be genuinely useful for advising travelers about route choices. In March, a deputy United States Marshal named Theodore Price came through the crossing with a question about a man who had passed through the previous autumn. Rosa pulled the relevant ledger and found the entry in under 2 minutes. The marshal looked at the information and looked at her and said, "I have been trying to get this information for 4 months. You should have come here sooner," she said. Price looked at Cyrus, who was working on the cable mechanism nearby. "Your wife is remarkable," he said. "She is," Cyrus said, without looking up from his work. "I recommend not making the mistake of underestimating that." "Noted," said the marshal. After Price left, Rosa found herself smiling at the far bank of the river for no reason she chose to examine carefully. That April, she discovered she was going to have a child. She told Cyrus on a Thursday evening, sitting on the porch with the spring air coming off the water, and she told him the way she told him everything, directly and without delay. He was silent for long enough that she wondered whether she had misjudged his reaction, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it without speaking for another moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I have been feeling tired in the mornings, but that seems to be easing. What do you need?" "I need to keep running the crossing," she said. "I need to continue working at the same capacity for as long as that is sensible." "All right. I also need you to not start treating me as though I am fragile, because I am not." "I would not dare," he said, and the way he said it made her laugh, a real unguarded laugh, and he smiled hearing it. "And I need," she said more quietly, "to be honest with you about the fact that I am somewhat frightened, and that I trust you with knowing that." He looked at her steadily. "I know I am somewhat frightened as well. I think that is the appropriate response to something this significant." "Good, then we are aligned." "We usually are," he said. She thought about the ferry, and about her father's letter, and about freedom, and she thought that this was not what she had imagined when she first stood on this bank in 1880, and looked at the land she had been given, and decided what she was going to build from it. But it was more than she had imagined. She had built the ferry and the freedom and the records of the world passing through, and she had done all of it on her own terms. And the man sitting beside her had come to her on her terms and stayed on her terms, and she had opened the door on her terms. And all of it together was something her father's letter had known was possible even when she had not quite believed it. The summer was demanding. The traffic increased further, and the expansion of the dock had been wise, and there were days when Rosa worked from dawn to past noon running crossings continuously before Cyrus took over for the afternoon runs. She maintained the ledger throughout, adapting her recording practice so she could make entries more quickly without losing the detail that made them valuable. She developed a shorthand system for horse descriptions that cut the entry time by a third without reducing accuracy. She was pleased with the shorthand system. Naomi Fixico visited regularly through the summer and taught Rosa things about the practical realities of pregnancy and childbirth that no book had covered with sufficient specificity. Rosa received this information with the same focused attention she brought to engineering pamphlets. Knowledge was knowledge. The source did not reduce its value. In August, a man arrived at the crossing who was not a settler or a cattle driver or a traveler or a lawman. He was a thin man in a dark coat who said he was a journalist from a paper in Kansas City, and that he had been following a story about the use of frontier crossing records in law enforcement work, and had been referred to the Merriweather crossing by the marshal's office in Guthrie. He wanted to write about the ledger system. Rosa considered him. "What exactly do you want to write?" she asked. "The story of how a woman operating a ferry crossing in Indian Territory developed a record-keeping system that has been used to solve at least 4 documented criminal cases in the past year," he said. "5, she said. 5 cases," he amended, producing a notebook. "May I ask questions?" "You may ask." "I will decide which ones to answer." He wrote for 2 hours. He was a careful journalist, which she appreciated, and when he quoted her he did so with accuracy and without the condescension she had been prepared for. When he asked about her husband, she said that Cyrus was her partner in the operation, and that his background in tracking and law enforcement had contributed to several of the system refinements implemented in the past year, which was true, and which she said because it was true, not because she felt any obligation to include him. Cyrus, who had been nearby during the interview without inserting himself, said nothing until the journalist had crossed the river and ridden away. "You did not have to mention me," he said. "I mentioned you because it was accurate," she said. "I do not say inaccurate things to be polite, and I do not omit accurate things to make myself look better. The refinements we developed together are better than the ones I had alone. That is simply the truth." He was quiet for a moment. I spent a considerable amount of time being grateful that I was riding on the wrong trail that afternoon, he said. The wrong trail brought you to the right crossing, she said. I think there is a lesson in that about the value of unexpected information. He put his arm around her shoulders, careful with the weight of it but not tentative, and she leaned against him just slightly, which was more than she would have believed of herself 2 years ago, and they watched the river together. The article appeared in the Kansas City paper in September and was reprinted in 2 other papers, one in Wichita and one in Fort Smith. Rosa received 3 letters in response, one from a territorial judge who wanted to discuss the potential formalization of crossing records as legal evidence, one from a woman in Missouri who was running a toll bridge and wanted advice about her own record-keeping practices, and one from the Kansas City journalist who had found a publisher interested in a longer piece about frontier women and their enterprises, and wanted to know whether Rosa would be willing to be a central subject. She wrote back to all 3. To the judge she said she would be willing to discuss the matter. To the Missouri woman she wrote 4 detailed pages about ledger structure and indexing methods. To the journalist she said she was willing to be interviewed further but that the final piece would need to be reviewed by her before publication. Cyrus read the draft of her letter to the journalist over her shoulder and said, "You should ask for compensation, not just review rights." She looked at the letter. "You are right," she said, and added a line. Their son was born on the 2nd of October, 1884, during a night of steady autumn rain that drummed on the roof of the small house, while Naomi Fixico and another Creek woman named Lucinda worked with calm efficiency, and Cyrus sat on the porch in the rain waiting with a patience that cost him considerably more than it appeared to. When Naomi opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 2 steps, and Rosa was sitting up with the child and looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, not less than her usual precision but more than it, something that contained all of it and then had more room. "He is well," she said. "I am well." Cyrus sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and emphatic and already seemed to have opinions about his situation. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. "I thought Ellis," she said, "after my father, Ellis James Merriweather Brenner." "Ellis James Merriweather Brenner," he repeated. "That is a substantial name for a person this small. He will grow into it," she said. He looked at her then, at Rosa, who had built a ferry from raw timber and a compass and a pamphlet and her own intelligence and determination, who had built a record of the world so accurate and precise that it had changed the trajectory of lives, who had opened a door she had never expected to open and led him through it, and who was now holding their son in the lamplight of the frontier night with the river running below and the rain on the roof. "Rosa," he said. "Yes, I love you." She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have for quite some time." "How long?" "Since you looked at the ledger for the first time," she said. "You did not look at it the way most people would have, as a tool to be used and discarded. You looked at it the way you look at something you recognize as having real value. I thought a man who could recognize that kind of thing was probably worth knowing." He shook his head slowly. "I looked at the ledger because I needed the information." "You stayed looking because you found it genuinely remarkable," she said. "There is a difference. You notice everything." "I do," she said. "It is one of my better qualities." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, careful not to disturb Ellis, who had closed his eyes and arrived at the particular compact stillness of a newborn who has decided, at least temporarily, to stop having opinions. The months that followed were the fullest of either of their lives. Ellis was a serious baby who became a curious child, interested in everything around him, and Rosa began teaching him to read before he was 3 years old using the same systematic approach she brought to everything. Cyrus taught him, as soon as he was old enough to be taught, how to observe the river and the weather and the behavior of horses, basic skills of attention and interpretation that Cyrus had spent 15 years acquiring through trial and considerable error. The ferry operation grew. The expansion Cyrus had built in the winter of 1883 was joined by a second expansion in the spring of 1886, and by 1887, the Merriweather Crossing, as it was formally known in all territorial records, was handling a volume of traffic that Rosa tracked meticulously in ledgers that now numbered 17. The shorthand system she had developed during her pregnancy had been further refined, and she had written it up as a formal guide that she sent, at the judge's request, to 3 other territorial crossing operators. Theodore Price, the marshal who had visited in 1884, became a regular correspondent. He sent inquiries about specific travelers when his investigations led to the territory, and Rosa answered those she could answer from her records and declined those she could not with equal precision. She had developed a clear policy about what information she would and would not share and under what circumstances, a policy she had worked out with Cyrus over a winter evening and 2 pots of coffee, and she held to it consistently because consistency was the foundation of reliability, and reliability was something she refused to compromise. Cyrus stopped bounty hunting entirely by 1886. He did not announce this decision or make it into a formal statement. He simply found one morning that he had not taken a job in 4 months and had not missed it, and when he examined why, the answer was straightforward. He was not looking for something anymore. He had found it. He took on occasional work as a guide for territorial surveyors, which allowed him to use his knowledge of the landscape and his tracking skills in a way that did not require him to be absent for extended periods, and he turned out to have a talent for the work that surprised the surveyors and did not surprise Rosa at all. There was an afternoon in the summer of 1887 when a group of 3 men arrived at the crossing who gave Rosa an immediate feeling that she had learned to trust. They were polite and paid their fee and said nothing objectionable, but something about the particular combination of their behavior and their equipment triggered a pattern recognition response that her years of record-keeping had developed to a high degree of accuracy. She crossed them without incident and logged their description in thorough detail, and after they had ridden east she went to find Cyrus. 3 men just crossed, she said. Eastern direction. I want to send a message to Price's office. He looked at her. What did you see? 2 of them are riding horses that have been reshod within the last day or 2. Fresh shoe marks, not worn at all, but the horses are tired, which means they have been ridden hard in shoes that do not fit well. Horses that have been reshod in a hurry from a non-standard source. The 3rd man has a coat that is too large for him, which men do not generally choose when they have the option, which suggests he acquired it recently and did not acquire it from a tailor or a store. She paused. One of them had a crescent-shaped burn scar on the back of his right hand that matches the description Price sent last month in connection with a robbery in Ponca City. Cyrus looked at her for a long moment. He had seen her do this before, this rapid and precise assembly of observed details into a conclusion, and he had been completely stopped in his tracks the first time and had never quite stopped being impressed by it in the years since. I will ride to Guthrie while you get the message written, he said. I can have the written description ready in 10 minutes, she said. I know you can, he said. The 3 men were apprehended 2 days later outside Stillwater, which Rosa noted was the same location where Cyrus had caught Cole Duchamp 4 years earlier, and she thought there was something almost elegantly circular about that. Price wrote to thank her and included, this time, a formal acknowledgement from the Marshal's Office of the Service the Merriweather Crossing records had provided to law enforcement in the territory. Rosa pinned the letter to the wall of the house next to her father's letter, which had lived on that wall since the first day she moved in, and she thought her father would have liked this particular sequence of events, the chain of consequences that began with a filing at a land office and a set of carpenter's tools and a pamphlet about bridge engineering. The second child came in 1888, a daughter this time, and they named her Clara after no one in particular, but because it was a name that sounded like what she looked like, which was clear and bright and entirely certain of herself from the first moment of her life. Clara had Cyrus's dark eyes and Rosa's quality of focused attention, and a temperament that combined the best of both in ways that made her parents occasionally look at each other with expressions of mutual amazement. Ellis, who was 4 when Clara arrived, greeted his sister with the serious air of someone who has been given a significant new responsibility and intends to take it seriously. He sat beside her and studied her face for a long time and then looked up at Rosa and said, "She is observing us." "She is," Rosa agreed. "She has good eyes," Ellis said. "She does," Rosa said. "She comes from a family that pays attention." Cyrus, standing in the doorway, heard this and felt the particular warmth of a man who has ended up in the right place and knows it without any qualification or remaining doubt. The Cimarron crossing in the spring of 1889, the year Oklahoma Territory was formally organized from the unassigned lands, saw the largest volume of traffic in its history. The land runs brought thousands of settlers through the territory, and the Merriweather crossing was one of the key transit points on the Cimarron. Rosa and Cyrus worked 16-hour days through April and May, running crossings from before dawn until after dark, logging everything with meticulous precision, even when exhaustion made the simple act of lifting a pen feel demanding. She hired 2 young men from the Creek community to assist with the physical operation during the rush, paying them fairly and teaching them the system with the same patience she brought to Ellis's reading lessons, and they proved competent and reliable, and the operation ran without significant incident through the most demanding weeks. At the end of May, when the first rush had passed and the crossing had returned to its demanding but manageable ordinary volume, Rosa sat down at the kitchen table with the complete stack of ledgers she had filled since April and calculated that she had logged over 3,000 individual crossings in 6 weeks. She showed the number to Cyrus. He sat down across from her and looked at the figure for a long time. "Rosa," he said, "you are building something that will outlast us." She looked at the ledgers, 19 of them now. "That is the intention," she said. "Records do not expire. Someone 50 years from now will be able to know exactly who passed through this crossing in the spring of 1889 and what direction they were headed and what they were carrying and what the river was doing. That will matter to someone eventually." "It already matters," he said. "It has mattered to a great many people in a great many ways." "I know," she said. "I am simply saying it will continue to matter." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen of the house she had built on the land her father had filed for her in a territorial land office in a life that had made itself, step by careful step, into more than either letter or ledger had ever been able to fully predict. The year 1889 also brought a development that Rosa had not expected. A school was being organized in the settlement that had grown up 2 miles east of the crossing, a proper territorial school with a building and a teacher hired from Ohio. School board, which consisted of 3 men who arrived at the crossing one afternoon in October, asked Rosa whether she would be willing to serve as a trustee. She looked at the 3 men. She looked at Cyrus, who was nearby and whose expression communicated clearly that this was entirely her decision and that he would support whatever she decided. "I will serve as chair of the board," she said. "Not trustee, chair." The 3 men exchanged a brief look. "The chair position was intended for," began one of them. "I am aware of what it was intended for," Rosa said pleasantly. "I'm also the person in this county with the most extensive records of the community that school will serve, the most systematic understanding of the educational needs of this territory based on 3 years of conversations with settlers and traders and families passing through this crossing, and the most time invested in teaching reading to children in this community already. If you want my involvement, you have it on those terms. If you prefer different terms, you are welcome to find a trustee elsewhere." The 3 men consulted quietly. Then the spokesman said, "Chair of the board, we accept." "Excellent," Rosa said. My first recommendation is that we include the Creek and Cherokee children from the Eastern Bank communities in the enrollment. Their families have equal right to a territorial school, and I will not participate in an institution that excludes them. Another consultation. Agreed, said the spokesman. Cyrus, after the men had crossed the river and ridden away, sat on the porch railing and looked at her with the particular expression he had worn at intervals throughout their marriage, the one that was a descendant of the look he had given her when she put the ledger on the table between them in April of 1883. "You knew they would agree," he said. "I thought they probably would," she said. "They wanted the legitimacy of my involvement more than they wanted control of the board. People often value the substance of a thing over the form of it when they are made to choose between them. You gave them no choice." "I gave them a very clear choice," she said. "I simply made sure that the costs and benefits of each option were entirely apparent." He shook his head and smiled. "Remarkable woman," he said. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." She served as chair of the Cimarron Territorial School Board for the first 3 years of its existence, during which time enrollment doubled, the building was expanded, a second teacher was hired, and a small lending library was established using a combination of donated books and a collection that Rosa organized from her own shelves and ordered from her Kansas City bookseller. Harrison Fixico's grandchildren attended the school. Ellis Brenner attended alongside them and formed, with a Creek boy named Thomas Fixico, the kind of childhood friendship that endures. In the spring of 1891, Cyrus came to Rosa with something he had been thinking about for some time. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, which was where they held their most serious conversations by long habit, and he said, "I have been offered a position." "What kind of position?" "Territorial surveyor. Full appointment, not contract work. It would require some travel but less than my former work, and the base would be here. I would be home every 2 weeks at minimum." He paused. "The appointment comes with a formal title and a small salary and the requirement that I produce documentation of my qualifications." "What documentation do they want?" "Letters of reference," he said, "and a record of relevant experience." "I will write the letter of reference," she said. "Rosa, you do not have an official title or position that would normally—" "I am the chair of the Cimarron Territorial School Board," she said. "I am the operator of this crossing, which is formally registered with the Territorial Land Office and has provided documented assistance to the Territorial Marshal's Office in 5 recorded cases. I correspond regularly with a territorial judge. My references are at least as strong as anyone else who might write on your behalf." She looked at him. "Unless you would prefer someone else wrote it." "I would prefer no one else wrote it," he said. "Then I will write it." The letter she wrote was 2 pages, single-spaced, and contained the kind of specific and precisely evidenced endorsement that made the Territorial Surveyor's office accept the application within a week. The man who read the letter later told a colleague that it was the most compelling professional reference he had received in 11 years of appointments, which the colleague repeated, and which eventually made its way back to Rosa through the ordinary channels of frontier gossip, and which she received without comment, but with a quiet satisfaction she was under no obligation to share with anyone. Cyrus received the appointment in May of 1891. He worked as a territorial surveyor for the next 7 years, mapping land that needed mapping, contributing to the formal documentation of boundaries and waterways that the emerging state would eventually rely upon. He was good at the work in a way that satisfied him, and he came home to the crossing every 2 weeks as promised, and sometimes more often when the survey work was close enough to allow it. Ellis, by the time he was 8, had begun helping with the ferry crossing on weekends and after school. He had his mother's head for numbers and his father's spatial sense, and he had grown up logging crossings since before he could reliably write and could now produce a legible and accurate entry faster than either of his parents, which Rosa observed without surprise and with considerable pride. Clara, at 5, had decided she was interested primarily in horses, specifically in their medical care, a preoccupation that had begun when a mare crossed the ferry with a badly split hoof and Rosa had given her daughter a brief explanation of the problem while they waited for the horse's owner to return. And Clara had listened with a focus that was startling in a 5-year-old and then had said very seriously, "Someone should fix that." "Someone should," Rosa agreed. "Can I learn how?" "I will find you books," Rosa said, "and I will find you a person who knows." She found both. The books came from Kansas City. The person was a veterinarian in Guthrie who agreed, after an exchange of letters with Rosa that he later described as the most articulate correspondence he had received from the parent of a 5-year-old, to allow Clara to accompany him on farm visits when she was old enough, and to teach her what she wanted to learn. These were the things Rosa built. Not only the ferry and the ledgers and the school board and the lending library, but the architecture of attention and possibility inside which her children grew up believing that what they were interested in was worth pursuing with rigor and without apology. On a warm September evening in 1892, Rosa and Cyrus sat on the porch of the house that had been added to twice since its original construction, 3 rooms now and a proper loft, with a new porch railing Cyrus had built from cedar, and a pair of chairs with cushions that were an extravagance Rosa had permitted herself one autumn when the year's accounts were particularly strong. The river moved below in the early dark, and from inside came the sounds of Ellis reading to Clara from a book about horses, Clara occasionally interrupting with questions that Ellis answered with the patient older sibling authority of someone who has read widely enough to manage most questions but knows his limits. "You ever think about what would have happened if Dutchamp had gone south instead of east?" Cyrus asked. Rosa considered. "Yes," she said, "occasionally. What do you think about when you think about it?" "I think about all the things that would not exist," she said. "The school, Ellis and Clara, this porch." She paused. "You." He was quiet. "But I also think," she said, "that the ledger would still exist. The records would still be here. I would still be here at this crossing with this life." She looked at the river. "And I think that is important to acknowledge. What I have built was not contingent on you arriving. You are the best part of it, but not the foundation." He turned to look at her. "I say that," she said, "not to diminish you. I say it because it is the kind of truth I think you should know about me and about us. I loved you freely. I chose you freely, not from need but from recognition." He reached over and took her hand. "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I love most about you, that your yes is a real yes because it was never the only option." She held his hand and looked at the river, and the evening settled around them the way evenings settled on the prairie, slowly and completely, until the stars came out over the Cimarron and the cottonwoods were black shapes against the dark sky, and the river moved on below, steady and indifferent and magnificent. Inside, Ellis had apparently answered one of Clara's questions incorrectly because Clara's voice rose in cheerful argument, and Cyrus and Rosa looked at each other and she pressed her lips together to control the smile and he did not bother controlling his. "She gets that from you," he said. "The certainty of being correct, the willingness to say so." "Then yes," she said. "She gets it from me." In 1895, the Territorial Land Office formally requested copies of the Merriweather crossing ledgers for the years 1880 through 1894, as part of a comprehensive effort to document historical patterns of settlement and movement through what would become the state of Oklahoma. Rosa spent 2 months producing detailed certified copies, retaining the originals as was her absolute right, and delivered the copies in person to the office in Guthrie, accompanied by Cyrus and Ellis, who was 11 and had been brought along specifically so that he could see the building where his mother's work was being formally recognized as part of the official historical record. The land office director, a man named Arthur Healy, spent an hour going through the ledgers with Rosa and asking questions, and afterward said to Cyrus, "Your wife's record-keeping is going to be cited by historians for generations." "She is aware," Cyrus said. "She planned it that way." Healy looked uncertain whether this was a joke. It was not. The 26th ledger was begun in January of 1896, and Rosa's handwriting in it was still precise, though she noted to herself that the morning light required a slightly better position than it used to. She had been 39 years old in October, and she felt 40 approaching not as an ending but as a new measurement mark, a way of calculating distance traveled and distance remaining, and the calculation, when she ran it, was strongly positive. Cyrus, at 44, had the look of a man who had spent his life outdoors and had made his peace with what that meant for a person's face and hands. And he wore it well, better than well, in the way that some people settle into their age like a house that was built right settles into its foundation. He was still the same essential person who had ridden up to the dock that first afternoon, but more visible now, more fully himself, the way a photograph becomes clearer as the exposure extends. They had the kind of marriage that people around them noticed without always being able to articulate precisely what they were noticing. The way they moved through a shared space with unspoken coordination. The way they finished each other's sentences, not because either finished the other's thoughts, but because they had been thinking alongside each other long enough to know where a thought was headed. The way Cyrus watched Rosa work with an attention that was not supervision, but something closer to the particular pleasure of witnessing excellence in a person you love. The way Rosa trusted Cyrus's judgment in the areas where his knowledge exceeded hers without any diminishment of her own certainty in the areas where hers exceeded his. Harrison Fixico died in the winter of 1897, and Rosa and Cyrus attended the funeral with the family, and Rosa spoke at the graveside in the measured and respectful way of someone who understood she was a guest in a grief that belonged primarily to others, but that she shared genuinely. She said that Harrison Fixico had been the first person on the Cimarron who had treated her as someone who belonged there, and that this kindness had made it possible for her to build everything she had built, and she said it in the clear voice she used for things that were true and important and needed to be said directly. Thomas Fixico, Harrison's grandson and Ellis's childhood friend, stood beside Ellis at the graveside, and Rosa looked at the two young men, 15 and just entering the world that would require everything of them. And she thought about all the ways that human dignity persists and insists on itself against the forces that would diminish it. And she was glad, again and always, that she had insisted on the Creek children in the school enrollment. In 1898, Ellis turned 14 and announced that he intended to study engineering. He had read everything in the house that was relevant, which was considerable, and had been corresponding with a professor at the Territorial Normal School in Edmond about the curriculum of mechanical engineering studies available in the region, and he had concluded that he would need to go further afield for the depth of study he wanted, and was requesting his parents' support in investigating options. Rosa and Cyrus sat across from him at the kitchen table where the important conversations always happened and listened to his presentation, which was well organized and clear and had clearly been prepared with some care. And at the end of it Rosa said, "You have done your research." "I tried to be thorough," Ellis said. "You were." She looked at Cyrus. Cyrus looked at her. "We will need to look at the finances," Cyrus said. "There are good programs in Kansas and in Missouri. We can investigate both." "I already have the tuition figures," Ellis said, and produced a piece of paper. Cyrus took the paper. He looked at it, and then he looked at Rosa with the expression that meant what it had meant for 15 years, that he was experiencing a specific kind of wonder at the people they had made together. "He gets this from you," Cyrus said. "The preparation," Rosa asked. "The thoroughness." "Then yes," she said, "he gets it from me." Ellis went to Kansas in 1900, the year after the land that Rosa's father had filed on was formally incorporated into the new state of Oklahoma. He studied mechanical engineering, with the same focused attention his mother had brought to bridge engineering pamphlets, and he wrote home every week without exception, Letters that were detailed and intelligent and occasionally contained questions about the ferry operation that led to correspondence with his professors about river crossing mechanics. Clara, who was 15 in 1900, had by then spent 4 years accompanying the veterinarian in Guthrie on his rounds, and had been declared by him the most talented student he had ever taught, and was determinedly gathering information about the limited options available to a young woman who wanted to study veterinary medicine in 1900, which were significantly fewer than they should have been but not. She had decided, 0. Rosa helped her investigate every option. She wrote letters to institutions in 3 states. She was not surprised by the frequency of rejection, but she was precise and persistent in her advocacy for her daughter, and she told Clara, at every point of frustration, what her own father had told her, that the world would put up the obstacles it had available, and the question was not whether the obstacles were fair but whether you were going to go around them or through them. Clara chose through them, which Rosa had expected and which made her privately fiercely proud. On an October evening in 1901, Rosa and Cyrus sat on the porch again, as they had sat on this porch on so many evenings over the years, watching the Cimarron move in the last of the light. The cottonwoods had grown considerably in 2 decades, and their shade in summer had become a reliable pleasure. The dock had been rebuilt twice, and was now a structure that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had hauled the first planks down to the bank in 1880, not because it had changed its essential purpose, but because it had grown into its full capacity. 21 ledgers of daily records sat on the shelf in the house behind them. 5 more had been delivered to the land office. The records stretched back 21 years. "I want to show you something," Rosa said. She had been thinking about this for several months. She went inside and came back with the first ledger, the one from 1880, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her handwriting but younger, less settled, still developing the precision that it had fully achieved by the second year. The first entry was dated April 12, 1880. 1 passenger on horseback, eastern direction. No additional description recorded because she had not yet developed the system. She had crossed the first person over this river 21 years ago. "Look at how many people have passed through this crossing," she said. He looked at the ledger and then looked out at the river. "How many do you estimate?" "Based on my annual averages and the records, somewhere between 40 and 45,000 individual crossings over 21 years, she said. 45,000 people who passed through this point. Some of them we will never know what became of them. Some of them we know very well. Some of them you brought to justice. Some of them brought things through that built the territory. Some of them we simply got across the water and on their way." "That is not a small contribution," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." He looked at her in the October light and she looked back at him, and they held each other's gaze in the comfortable way of 2 people who have been looking at each other long enough to see everything and choose it completely. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about my father's letter," she said, "the one on the wall." "What does it say?" She had told him before, but she said it again. "It says that the ferry business, if I built it right, would make me free." "And did it?" She looked at the river. She looked at the house with the cedar-railed porch and the 21 ledgers on the shelf, and the kitchen table where important things were decided, and the loft where her children had slept and grown and gone out into a world that was slightly more documented for their mother's attention. She looked at the man beside her who had come to her on the wrong trail and stayed because he was smart enough to recognize the right one. "Yes," she said, "it made me free." She reached over and took his hand the way she had reached over and taken things all her life, deliberately and without hesitation, because she knew what had value and did not make the mistake of waiting for value to announce itself more loudly than it already had. "And it made me more than free," she said, "which I did not expect." "More than free," he repeated. "Yes, I expected freedom. I did not expect to be happy. Not like this. Not this specifically and this fully." He lifted her hand and held it against his chest for a moment, a gesture he had made before, a gesture that said without words the thing that they both understood was true and had been true for a long time. The Cimarron moved on below them. The cottonwoods shifted in the evening wind. Somewhere east, a whippoorwill called once into the darkening air. Rosa Merriweather had thought, in the spring of 1880, that she knew what she was building. She knew the materials and the method and the purpose and the expected outcome, and she had been correct about all of them. She had not known that the man who came on the wrong trail would become the best surprise of a life she had built precisely to require no surprises. She had not known that the ledger she kept out of practicality would outlast them both and be read by people they would never meet, in a state that did not yet exist when she drove the first piling into the Cimarron bank. She had not known that the word free would expand, the way good structures expand, to hold more than the original design specified. But she had known how to pay attention. And paying attention, as she had told Cyrus on a spring evening by the fire when she was first explaining the ledger system, was how you made sure the things that mattered left a record you could find your way back to. They had left a good record of the crossings and the work and the years and the love between them, which was the most thoroughly documented thing of all, written not in ledgers but in the specific and irreplaceable language of two people who had chosen each other freely, completely, and without reservation, on the wide bank of the Cimarron River in the Oklahoma Territory, in the last decades of the frontier, in the middle of an ordinary, extraordinary life. The 22nd ledger was begun the following morning in Rosa's steady hand at the top of a fresh page. Date, time, direction, description, the river running clear and cold in the October dawn. One crossing, already logged, the ferryman herself passing from one shore to the other and back again, as she had done 10,000 times before and would do 10,000 times more, on the river that had made her free.